He walked into the music academy slowly, almost as if he was unsure whether he was even allowed to be there. His clothes were plain and slightly faded, the kind that made people assume he didn't come from a wealthy background. He didn't try to hide it. He wasn't the type of person who cared much about appearances. What mattered to him was the piano, and that was the only reason he had gathered the courage to walk into a place where almost everyone judged others within the first few seconds. As he entered the long hallway filled with echoing voices, many students turned to look at him. Some whispered to each other. Others just stared with a confused expression, as if wondering why someone like him would come to an audition meant for serious musicians. A few of them had shiny branded bags, neatly pressed outfits, and expensive-looking instruments. They looked like people who had been trained since childhood, the kind who knew exactly how to impress. He didn't look like them at all. The hall smelled of polish and old wood, and the sound of someone practicing a scale drifted from one of the rooms. He held a thin folder of sheet music tightly in his hand. The papers inside were worn out at the edges, some torn slightly where he had turned the pages too many times. He had practiced these pieces for months. He didn't know whether they were the right choice or not, but they were the only ones he felt connected to. A group of students near the wall noticed the folder and exchanged looks. One of them chuckled softly. Another raised his eyebrows and whispered, "He looks like he's here by mistake." The young man heard them clearly, but he didn't react. He had heard worse. All his life, people had looked at him with doubt, as if talent only came from those who could afford lessons, new clothes, and expensive instruments. He walked toward the audition room, trying to keep his breath steady. His hands were slightly cold. He wasn't scared to play. Playing was the one thing that made him feel alive, but he was scared of the judgment that always came before he even touched the piano keys. Inside the room, the director sat behind a long table. He was an older man, known for being strict, someone who rarely smiled. Everyone respected him, but many feared him too. The director looked up as the young man stepped in. He scanned him quickly from head to toe, not with cruelty, but with the kind of doubt that said he wasn't expecting anything impressive. The room felt colder than the hallway. A grand piano stood in the center, shining under the light. It looked perfect, untouched, almost too elegant to be real. He had never played a piano like that before. At home, the only instrument he had was an old keyboard with faded keys, some of them needing extra pressure to work. The director cleared his throat. "Name?" he asked in a firm tone. The young man spoke softly, but his voice didn't shake. The director wrote something on a sheet of paper, still looking unsure. He then nodded toward the piano and said, "You can begin when you're ready." He walked to the piano, feeling all the eyes in the room following him. Most of the students waiting outside peeked through the small glass window on the door. He could almost feel their expectations. Most of them expected him to fail. They thought he would press a wrong note or shake so much that he wouldn't even be able to sit properly. When he reached the piano stool, he paused for a moment and placed his folder gently on the stand. He sat down slowly, adjusting the seat to a height that felt right. His heart was thumping a little faster now, but it wasn't fear. It was something between excitement and hope. He hadn't come here to prove anyone wrong. He had come here because music was the only thing that made sense in his life. Behind him, the director watched silently, still not expecting much. He rested his hands on his lap, closed his eyes for a second, and took a deep breath. He wasn't thinking about the students outside or the whispers in the hallway. He wasn't thinking about the doubt on the director's face. All he thought about was the hours he had spent practicing alone, the nights he stayed awake repeating the same melody until he could play it. With his eyes closed, he lifted his hands and placed them on the keys gently. His fingers felt the smooth surface that was so different from the rough keyboard he had at home. It felt like touching something sacred, but before he started playing, his mind wandered back for a moment to the life he had come from. He had grown up in a small neighborhood where most families lived day to day. There were no music schools nearby, no teachers offering lessons, and definitely no quiet rooms where he could practice without interruption. His father worked long hours, and his mother took care of the household. But every night, no matter how tired everyone was, The old keyboard would sit in the corner, waiting for him. He had found that keyboard by chance. It belonged to a neighbor who was moving away. The neighbor saw how fascinated he was with it and gave it to him, saying, "Maybe you'll make something beautiful with this someday." The keyboard barely worked. But for him, it was everything. While other kids played outside, he sat with his keyboard for hours. He taught himself by watching online videos. Sometimes the internet didn't work, and he had to wait staring at a loading circle. But he didn't complain. He would just press keys randomly, trying to recreate sounds he had heard earlier. He remembered the night he first played a full piece correctly. He had been alone in the small room, and when the last note faded, he felt something warm settle inside him. That was when he knew he wanted to play piano for the rest of his life, but wanting it was one thing. Having the opportunity was another. People in his area didn't often dream big. They worked hard just to survive. So when he told a few people that he wanted to audition for a well-known music academy, they looked at him the same way the students in the hallway had looked at him, confused, amused, and doubtful, but he didn't care. He saved money for months just to buy the bus ticket to the academy. His parents didn't have much to offer, but they gave him their blessing, telling him to try his best and not worry about anything else. Now, here he was, sitting in front of the most beautiful piano he had ever seen. With people waiting to judge him, he opened his eyes again. His fingers hovered over the keys. The room was quiet. For a moment, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. He pressed the first key gently, letting the sound ring out. It felt warm, rich, and full in a way he had never experienced before. He almost smiled, not because he wanted to impress anyone, but because he was finally hearing the music the way he had always imagined it. He continued playing softly at first, just testing the sound. The director leaned back slightly, still expressionless. The young man didn't rush. He wanted to feel every note, every vibration running through the keys. Then, after a few breaths, he was ready to begin the actual piece he had practiced for so long. Outside the room, the students quieted down. The ones who had been laughing earlier leaned closer to the door, curious about what he was going to do. None of them could guess what was about to happen. None of them knew that this was the moment he had been preparing for his entire life. And inside the room, with his hands steady and his heart full, he pressed the first powerful note of the piece, not to prove himself, but to finally show the world who he truly was. The moment his fingers pressed down and the first note filled the room, something inside him changed. It was as if the piano welcomed him, as if it understood his story without him saying a single word. The sound was richer than anything he had ever played on his old keyboard at home. It felt warm, deep, and full, so full that it almost made his chest tighten. He let that first note linger for a moment, then slowly continued. At first, his hands moved carefully. He didn't want to make a mistake right at the beginning. But with each passing second, he grew more confident. His fingers knew the path across the keys because they had traveled that same path hundreds of times late at night, alone in his room when the world outside was quiet. Even though this piano was different, bigger, and stronger than the one he knew, the music inside him stayed the same. As the melody grew, a soft memory rose in his mind. It wasn't something he tried to remember. It just came. He saw himself as a younger kid, sitting on the floor with the broken keyboard placed on two wooden stools. The keyboard was old even then. Some keys didn't respond. Some were too sensitive. But he used to tap each one, trying to understand how sound worked. He remembered the small smile on his mother's face when she heard him play a simple tune for the first time. She didn't say much, but her eyes said everything. She believed in him. Even before he believed in himself, that memory gave him strength as he continued playing. His shoulders relaxed and his breathing became steady. He no longer felt like he was in an audition room. It felt more like he was back home, lost in his own world. The director, who had been sitting still with a doubtful expression, slowly leaned forward. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was subtle, almost as if he didn't even realize he was doing it. There was something about how the young man played, the softness at certain moments, the power at others that caught his attention. This wasn't someone who had taken expensive lessons or practiced in fancy studios. This was someone who played from a place deeper than technique. He continued the piece, his fingers flowing smoothly over the keys. His eyes weren't fixed on the director or the people outside. They weren't even fixed on the sheet music. He didn't need it. The music lived inside him, and he let it guide him. But behind that confidence was a lifetime of struggle. He remembered how, as a child, he used to sneak into the neighbor's house whenever the neighbor wasn't home. The man kept a radio on a small shelf, and sometimes classical music played. He would stand next to it, listening carefully, trying to catch every note. He didn't know the names of the pieces. He just knew they made him feel something, feeling that nothing else gave him. He had once asked an older cousin what it felt like to learn music properly. The cousin laughed and said, "People like us don't get to learn that." He didn't say anything after that, but inside he refused to accept it. He told himself that even if he couldn't take lessons, even if he didn't have a real piano, he would learn somehow. That stubborn hope shaped him into who he was now. As he played, he thought of the nights when his father came home late. The small house barely had enough space for everyone, and when he practiced, the sound reached every corner. His father was tired after long work hours, but instead of complaining, he always said, "If this is what makes you happy, don't stop." Those words stayed with him through every difficult moment. The audition room was still quiet. The director's assistant, who had been sorting documents earlier, slowly stopped and lifted her head. She wasn't expecting anything special either, but something about the music made her look up. It wasn't just skill. It was emotion, pure and unfiltered. Outside the room, the students who had mocked him earlier went silent. One of them frowned, as if unsure whether what he was hearing was really coming from the same boy they had laughed at. Another student leaned closer to the door window, trying to see his hands. Someone whispered, "This can't be real. How is he playing like that?" Their voices were filled with disbelief, not cruelty anymore. Inside, his body moved with the rhythm. He wasn't a dancer, but when someone truly feels music, it shows in their shoulders, their breath, the way their head tilts slightly as they follow the melody. He played the soft parts with almost tender care, and when the powerful notes came, he didn't hold back. His hands struck the keys with confidence, and the sound filled every corner of the room. The director's eyebrows twitched. He wasn't smiling, not yet, but something in his eyes had changed. The doubt wasn't there anymore. Instead, there was curiosity, deep, honest curiosity. He wondered how someone who looked so unsure when entering the room could suddenly transform into someone who played with such conviction. As the piece approached its middle section, the young man reached the part he had always practiced the most. It was the section that had nearly defeated him many times. The rhythm shifted quickly, the notes climbed higher, and the tempo changed. On his old keyboard, it had taken him months to get it right. Some nights, he stayed up until morning just repeating that one part. But today, on this piano, this perfect, polished, shining piano, the music flowed easily. It felt almost effortless. His fingers didn't slip. His breathing didn't shake. He wasn't scared anymore. He reached the final section, the one where the music softened again. It felt like the piece itself was taking a deep breath after all its intensity. While he played it, another memory filled his mind, one he hadn't thought of in a long time. He remembered the day he first told his parents he wanted to take the academy audition. They had looked at each other with concern, not because they didn't believe in him, but because they knew how hard the world could be. After a long pause, his father placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Go, try. Even if nothing happens, at least you won't regret it later." He carried that sentence with him every single day. The more he played, the more he realized something important. He wasn't here to ask for approval. He wasn't here for applause or praise. He was here because music had shaped him, strengthened him, carried him through hard days, and given him a future when everything else looked uncertain. The director could sense it too. This wasn't just skill, it was heart. As the final notes approached, his tempo slowed. Each key he pressed seemed to hold a piece of his journey. The room felt different now. It wasn't just an audition hall anymore, it felt like a place where something unexpected was happening, something that none of them could have predicted. He pressed the last note, letting it linger naturally. He didn't rush to lift his hands. He waited until the sound faded completely, until the room fell silent once again. When he finally looked up, there was a new kind of quietness in the room. Not the judgmental quiet from earlier. This was a quiet filled with surprise. The director, who had barely shown any reaction before, slowly removed his glasses and placed them on the table. His eyes stayed on the young man, studying him differently now. There was no doubt in his expression anymore. There was something close to respect, deep, sincere respect. The young man didn't smile. He didn't puff out his chest or look proud. He simply waited, breathing softly, his hands resting on the keys. He wasn't thinking about the students outside. He wasn't thinking about the whispers or the laughs. He was thinking about one thing only. He did what he came here to do, and for the first time since entering the academy, he felt like he belonged in that room. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after he finished playing. He could still feel the last vibration of the final note inside his fingertips. It was strange. Moments earlier he had been nervous, unsure of what people would think, but now all he felt was calm. A deep, peaceful calm that came only after giving something your whole heart. He slowly lifted his hands from the keys and placed them on his lap. He didn't dare turn around yet. He wasn't afraid of their reactions. He just wanted to breathe for a second, to enjoy the silence that followed his music. Behind him, the director shifted slightly in his chair. The small sound was enough to make the young man look up. The director wasn't writing anymore. He wasn't checking forms or flipping pages. His hands were folded in front of him. His eyes focused entirely on the boy at the piano. And for the first time since the young man had stepped inside the room, the director looked impressed. The young man didn't know how to react. He had seen that expression on very few faces in his life, mostly from people who truly understood music. People who didn't judge by clothes or background or the price of an instrument. People who listened with their hearts. The director cleared his throat, but his voice sounded softer than before. Where did you learn to play like that? The question wasn't harsh. It wasn't accusatory. It sounded more like he was trying to understand something that didn't make sense to him. The young man hesitated. He didn't know what to say. Should he tell the truth that he had learned everything by himself on a broken keyboard? Would the director even believe him? I practiced at home, he finally said. I didn't have lessons. The director blinked slowly as if trying to process those words. The assistant, who had been silent all this time, glanced at the director with raised eyebrows. She hadn't expected that answer either. After a moment, the director leaned back in his chair. No lessons at all? The young man shook his head. No, sir. You played that piece almost perfectly, the director said. And with more emotion than many who study for years. The young man didn't know how to reply, so he just lowered his eyes respectfully. Compliments weren't something he received often. And when he did hear them, they felt unreal, almost like someone was talking about someone else. Before the director could say anything more, a soft noise came from the door. Someone outside had bumped the glass while trying to get a better look. The young man could hear whispers, quiet but intense. The students who had doubted him earlier were still gathered there, and now they weren't whispering insults, they were whispering in shock. The director turned his head slightly. Who's outside? The assistant stood and walked to the door. As soon as she opened it, several students stepped back, embarrassed. One of them stammered something about just passing by, but the director raised his hand to silence them. You can come in, he said calmly. The students hesitated, unsure whether they were in trouble. But the director's voice didn't sound angry. So one by one, they entered the room, some with their heads lowered, others still trying to sneak glances at the young man sitting at the piano. He felt exposed now. It was one thing to be judged silently behind a door. It was another to face the very people who had laughed at him. He didn't look at them directly. Instead, he kept his fingers lightly touching the edge of the piano. Grounding himself, the director looked at the group and then back at the young man. I think all of you should hear something important. The students shifted, clearly curious. This young man, the director continued, played a piece that even trained musicians struggle with. And he did it without formal training. The room grew even more silent. One student who had mocked him earlier looked shocked. Another student bit his lip, as if regretting something. They were all seeing him differently, now not as someone who didn't belong, but as someone who had something they didn't, raw, natural talent. The director turned to the young man again. "Do you have another piece prepared?" He nodded slowly. He had practiced 2 pieces, hoping to play at least one well. But the second one was special to him. It was the piece he connected with the most. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't complex in a way that impressed technical judges. But it had a kind of warmth that reminded him of home. "Play it," the director said gently. He took another deep breath, adjusted his position, and placed his fingers on the keys again. The new audience behind him made his chest tighten. But once he pressed the first note, the fear began to melt away again. This piece was softer, more emotional. The notes flowed like water, calm and smooth, carrying memories with them. As he played, he thought about the nights he had sat by the window, staring at a quiet street, dreaming of moments like this. He thought about how many times he wanted to give up when the keyboard keys got stuck or when people told him he was wasting time, but he never stopped. And now, as the music filled the room, he felt every hour of practice, every failure, every small victory building up to this moment. The students behind him were completely quiet. They didn't whisper anymore. They didn't fidget. Some of them closed their eyes, letting the melody pull them in. He played the piece with everything he had, his memories, his hopes, his struggles. His hands moved in a way that looked effortless, but the strength behind each movement came from years of persistence. By the time he reached the last part of the piece, the room felt heavier, filled with emotion. Even the assistant, who had seen countless auditions, stood still. Her eyes focused on the young man as if witnessing something rare. The final note floated through the air and faded slowly, leaving a silence that felt powerful. When he lifted his hands, his eyes were slightly watery, though he didn't know why. Maybe it was relief. Maybe pride. Maybe something deeper. He finally turned slightly to face the room. The director was standing. The students were staring at him as if they had discovered something unbelievable. The director walked closer to the piano, his steps slow, thoughtful. He didn't speak right away. When he finally did, his voice held a tone the young man had never heard from him before. "You," he said softly, "have a gift that cannot be taught." The young man's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know how to respond. The director continued, "I have seen many auditions, many talented people. But what you played today, it wasn't just skill, it was honesty. You play with your whole heart." One of the students near the door looked away, almost embarrassed for ever doubting the young man. The director placed a hand on the piano and looked at him directly. "Would you be willing to play one more piece?" The young man nodded slowly. He didn't have a third piece prepared, but he knew something. Whenever he truly felt music, he could play anything. His fingers would find their way. The director stepped back and gestured for him to begin. He took one last deep breath, closed his eyes, and started playing something entirely new. Something he had never practiced fully, something he had only explored late at night when he was too tired to think. It was a melody built from feeling, not structure. It told a story without words, and as he played, the room began to change again. The tension faded. The judgment dissolved. All that remained was music, powerful, pure, and real. When he finished, the room didn't erupt in applause. Instead, everyone stood quietly, almost overwhelmed. Sometimes silence says more than clapping ever could. The director exhaled slowly. "You're not just talented," he said. "You're remarkable." The young man looked down, trying to hide the emotion in his eyes. He had never heard words like that before. Not directed at him, the director stepped closer and said something he never expected to hear. "You belong here." Those 3 words hit him harder than anything else. In all his life, no one had ever said he belonged anywhere. And now, in that moment, surrounded by the very people who once laughed at him, he realized something life-changing. This was only the beginning. The room felt different now, much lighter than before. It was almost strange to think that just an hour ago, the same space had been filled with doubt, whispers, and judgment. Now it held something else entirely: respect. Quiet, sincere respect. The kind that isn't spoken loudly, but can be felt in the air. The young man sat there at the piano for a moment, still trying to process everything that had happened. He kept his hands resting on his lap, letting his breathing slow down. It felt like his whole body was buzzing with emotion, but in a good way. He didn't know whether he wanted to smile, cry, or simply sit in silence for a while. The director stood a few steps away from him, still watching him with thoughtful eyes. The students gathered near the back of the room didn't move either. They stayed still, almost afraid to disturb the quiet that had settled over them. Finally, the director walked closer until he stood beside the piano. His voice, when he spoke, sounded more gentle than firm now. "Do you know what you just did?" The young man looked up, unsure how to answer. "I just played, sir." "No," the director said softly. "You didn't just play. You took control of this entire room. Every person here felt what you felt. That is something very few musicians can do." The students exchanged glances. Some of them nodded slightly, still amazed. The director continued, "You don't come from a trained background. You don't come from a place where opportunities are handed to you. But what you do have is something natural, powerful, and rare." The young man lowered his eyes, feeling a lump form in his throat. Compliments like this never came easily to him. He never played the piano to impress anyone. He played because it was the only thing that made him feel grounded. The only thing that made him feel like he could express himself without speaking. After a long pause, the director finally said the words that would change everything. "I want to offer you a place here." The young man's eyes widened. For a moment he wasn't sure he heard correctly. He looked at the director, searching his face for any sign of doubt or hesitation, but there was none. "A place here?" he repeated softly. "Yes," the director replied. "If you agree, you can join the academy. I will personally make sure you get the guidance you need. You have too much talent to waste." The room grew even quieter. A few of the students looked surprised, but none of them disagreed. Even the ones who had mocked him earlier couldn't deny what they had witnessed. The young man swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say. His whole life he had dreamed of playing piano on a good instrument, learning from real teachers and being surrounded by people who loved music. But it had always felt like a dream, too big for him. Too far from his reality. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, seeing his struggle. The director smiled gently and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to answer right now. Take your time. Think about it." The assistant nodded in agreement and added, "We believe in you, truly." Slowly, the young man found his voice. I'm very thankful," he said quietly. "I didn't expect anything like this." "You earned it," the director replied firmly. "No one is doing you a favor. This is your talent speaking for you." Those words hit him deeply. He had always been judged for how he looked, where he lived, and what he didn't have. Hearing someone praise him for what he did have, something inside him felt life-changing. The students near the wall finally began moving, some stepping forward to get a closer look at him. A tall boy among them approached first, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. "Hey," he said awkwardly. I'm sorry for earlier. I didn't think you'd, play like that." The young man looked at him calmly. He wasn't angry. He was used to being misunderstood. Instead of holding on to the negativity, he simply nodded. "It's okay," he said softly. "People don't know me." Another student, a girl with long hair tied back in a neat ponytail, stepped forward and said, "You're playing." It honestly moved me. I didn't expect to feel something like that today. He blinked in surprise. Compliments were coming from every direction, but none of them sounded fake. They all seemed genuine. For the first time since stepping into the academy, he felt like he wasn't invisible anymore. The director gestured for everyone to give the young man space and then said, "Take a few minutes to rest. You've earned it." The young man nodded and stood up slowly. His legs felt a little weak, not from fear, but from the emotional weight of everything that had happened. He walked to the side of the room and sat on a small bench. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the moment settle inside him. His mind drifted back to his home, to his parents, to the neighborhood he came from. He wondered what they would say if they could see him right now. He imagined his mother smiling softly, his father nodding with quiet pride. After a few minutes, the director approached him again. "Are you feeling better?" "Yes, sir," he replied. "I want you to understand something," the director said calmly. "You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to impress anyone. You just have to continue what you did today, play with honesty." The young man nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him. The director then asked, "Do you have time to talk privately?" "Of course." The director led him into his office, a cozy room filled with books, old photographs, and framed scores. It smelled faintly of paper and wood polish. The young man sat while the director took a seat across from him. "I want to know more about you," the director said kindly. "Tell me about your background. Tell me how you learned." For the first time, the young man shared everything. He told him about the old keyboard given by the neighbor, the late nights spent practicing, the internet videos he watched, and how he never had a real teacher. He even talked about the doubts people had thrown at him, how nobody believed someone like him could make it in music. The director listened carefully, not interrupting once. When he finished, the director shook his head softly in disbelief. "To think you learned all of this on your own. It's incredible." The young man lowered his eyes again, feeling shy under such praise. "You have something that cannot be taught," the director continued. "And that is why I want you here. With the right training, you could become something extraordinary." Those words felt heavy, but in a hopeful way, the director leaned back and said, "But I want you to promise me something. What is it?" He asked quietly. "Promise me you won't doubt yourself again. Promise me you won't let anyone's opinion stop you." The young man took a deep breath. "I promise." The director smiled. "Good." As they walked back to the audition room, the students were waiting. Not to judge him, this time they were waiting to welcome him. A few even smiled at him warmly, as if silently saying, "You deserve this." The young man felt something he had never felt. Inside a place like this, belonging. Before he left, the director placed a hand on his shoulder once again and said, "This is your new beginning." The young man nodded, feeling emotion well up inside him. And when he stepped outside the academy building, the air felt different. The path ahead didn't feel impossible anymore. It felt real. It felt reachable. He looked at his hands that had once struggled on a broken keyboard. Hands that had carried his dreams quietly for so many years. Today, those same hands had opened a door to a new life. He smiled softly to himself. For the first time ever, he truly believed it. This was not the end of his journey. It was the start of everything he had ever dreamed of.